and I'm involved in the CIB, CIBSE, and TWR, this transdisciplinary workplace research community initiated by Rian Appel Moulenbroek in Eindhoven University, and she is with us in the audience today. And so this is very much geared to looking at what we do know about the workplace, but what are the things we don't know? What are the things we should be researching? What are the priorities? And I think we've got our four speakers are all very interesting in their own right. Nicola is going to start the proceedings. Nicola Gillen, who wrote the book Future Office in 2019, published by the RIBA, an excellent book. And she heads the total workplace at Cushman Wakefield that have also issued various reports on the workplace. After Nicola, Nigel Osland will follow, talking about personality traits and how that affects our consideration of the workplace. A fascinating presentation, I'm sure. And then it's particularly nice to have someone outside the UK, and Piers McNaughton, with his wonderful background there, as you can see, which we're told is somewhere north of Boston, has done tremendous output of very highly regarded research papers on the things that how the built environment affects the workplace, to sum it up very briefly. And his work is very, very notable. And under the Harvard, he was in the Harvard T.C. Chan Department of Health there. And then finally, Valerie Mace from the University of Arts in London, who again has done some really interesting research on interdisciplinary experiential design and how we approach that using occupant sensory interpretations and how we can meet that. So I think that will be interesting too. On practical matters, can I ask you, apart from the presenters, of course, can we all turn off our videos and microphones and open up the chat column so that we'll have questions at the end in the final panel session at 5 o'clock. And I'll get through as many questions as we can. I will tell you the proceedings are being recorded. They will be distributed. I think that's all from me. So it's now over to Nicola to open up the seminar, webinar.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you very much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here and talk to everybody. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now, dark blue screen. So I'm going to kick off with a summary of some research that we have done during the pandemic and share some of that data first of all, but then share what the key questions this has risen for us in terms of the future workplace and the questions we're trying to answer now with organizations around the world. So we have a tool which has been in existence for a number of years, a survey-based tool called Experience Per Square Foot. And it captures people's experience of the workplace against 5 different attributes, including people's ability to learn, their ability to bond with other people, their ability to collaborate, and their ability to renew, which is the ability to maintain levels of energy throughout the working day. And what we did at the beginning of the pandemic was we created a shorter version called Experience Per Square Foot at Home, which was specifically designed to capture people's experience of working remotely during the pandemic. We didn't release it until about 6 months into lockdown, and we kept it open for about 4 months. And what you can see here is a snapshot of the nature of the respondents that we had. So at this point, we're actually up to 64,000 people having responded to this from around the world and 3 million data points. So you can see here that the majority of the responses were from the US, with a reasonable split between EMEA and APAC. You can see here the split in terms of generations, Gen Z obviously being the youngest, so the fewest of those in the workforce. And then the split that we had in terms of functions. Those are not sectors, but they're functions. So people working in sales versus finance, for example. So this is a summary of the overall results here. And what was very interesting and surprising, perhaps to some, is that overall productivity remained fairly consistent according to people's self-reported data. 75% felt that they were able to collaborate and focus as well as at home as they could in the office. In fact, collaboration has gone up by 10% over that period. Though that's the good news. On the other side of the coin, personal connections and learning have suffered, with only 50% reporting that they are able to connect to company culture, and only 55% have a sense of well-being. We've also seen that younger generations are struggling more, and I'll come on to this more specifically in the next couple of slides. Overall, 78% of those who responded said that they would like remote working policies to either expand or continue as we move out of the pandemic. So looking at the responses by generation, the number one challenge that everybody reported was around subpar connectivity, regardless of location, which is interesting, and regardless of generation. The younger generation struggled more than any others, and that was relating to things like inadequate workspace, potentially in shared flats, or returning to parents' houses. Those in the middle had the biggest challenge around caregiving responsibilities on top of work. And what's also interesting is that the baby boomers, the older generation in the workforce, have had the most positive experience during this time. And that is also likely to be because of the fact that they don't have kids running around, and they may also have a room at home dedicated to work, whereas many of the other generations are working in rooms that are designed to do other things also. So this is a snapshot of the data when we look at Gen Z only, and you can see the things that are working well, and I won't read through all of this now, but it will give you an idea of their mood during the pandemic. What's interesting in terms of learning is that this 68% is about formal learning. When we look at informal learning and mentoring, that has suffered considerably over the period. And the things that they're struggling with are around connection to colleagues and culture, and a general sense of fulfillment. So what we're looking at here on screen is an interesting mix between reasons why people might continue to work remotely, and this is along the top, and reasons why people might return to the office. So along the top, I won't repeat some of those I mentioned earlier. One key shift is that 90% of those who responded feel trusted to carry out their work, and that's a significant shift from the situation before the pandemic, and trust was one of the biggest issues around preventing people from working remotely. Then in terms of why people want to return to the office, it is around things like a sense of well-being and purpose, connection to colleague, and connections to company culture, which is probably the single biggest topic that we're finding occupiers are interested in at the moment. This will give you a sense here of the data when you compare the EMEA results in red to the global results in blue. And what has been very interesting over the past few months is presenting this data, particularly to HR professionals around the world. And in our own research, we have found that we tend to get more negative results from a European audience. And we tend to get more positive results from other places in the world, regardless of the question asked. So that might be an interesting one for Nigel perhaps to come back on at some point in terms of the potential cultural overlay and attitude on research questions. Overall, we found the US responded more positively, as the US tends to surveys like this in comparison to Europe. And across Asia, it's quite a mixed picture where countries like India and China responded more positively to the questions, and countries like South Korea responded more negatively. So you can see here a snapshot of some of those experience scores by country. And unfortunately, for those of us in the UK, we had the worst experience of people in any country, which is interesting, could be a reflection of everything else that's going on in the UK at the same time. Yeah, I think there's an interesting cultural overlay there, and you can see some of the countries at this end of the scale that were responding more positively and indeed above the global average. And then if we look at the data in terms of the sectors, we can see that in general, government, healthcare, and professional services organizations did better over this period. They were able to do their work more effectively. And at the other end of the scale, we have tech and media, and interestingly, real estate and construction. Arguably, this is due to things like creative collaboration, which is also a point that we have noted has struggled over this period. So if we look at specific job functions now, what you're looking at here is where there is a little overlap between where there's the two shapes are very close together here between the diamond and the circle. This means that these people experienced very little difference between their experience in the office and their experience at home. Whereas the greater the gap on the left-hand side here shows that these people have experienced a much bigger difference. So you can see the sorts of functions along the bottom here, legal, finance, interestingly, customer services, are having about the same experience at home as they were in the office. Whereas on this side, we're looking at, for example, sales having the biggest gap. And this is another potentially interesting point for Nigel in terms of a personality overlay to generalize heavily on some of this. We often find a much larger proportion of extroverts in the sales organization, and it has been interesting to observe the differences between introverts and extroverts over this period. Some of this data starts to point to that. So in terms of some of the key questions that this data throws up in terms of working with occupier organizations and developers creating office buildings, these are the sorts of research questions that we are focused on at the moment and that we're being asked. So the first section is around how we work, and that's around who needs to come back to the office and how do we decide that? And how do we go about supporting a transition from, fully remote to a hybrid situation? And this is quite a complex one. How do we take care of a virtual workforce when we're used to having the office as a vehicle for doing that? In terms of location, key question is around where would organizations hire from now that location is less important than it was before? And ultimately, this leads to how much and what kind of real estate do organizations need, and how do they go about managing this kind of flexibility in the future? So this final slide summarizes some of these points and looking to the future. So return to the office, as we've seen, has not been straightforward. There was a return, and in various countries we're now back more working from home for the time being. Key risk areas of remote working is around younger people, particularly things like mentoring and informal learning, impact on culture. That's something that I think is a huge question moving forward, and something we're really only beginning to scratch the surface on as we head into our second 6 months of working remotely. One positive of the whole lockdown period has been what we're calling a new digital equality. So the disappearance, if you like, of major global cities and major headquarters building has reduced a locational and structural hierarchy, enabling a much greater diversity of voices to be heard across locations. And that's to do with geographies. And again, it's to do with personalities. And there's a huge opportunity here to leverage this diversity of voice and continue it as we return to whatever the new normal is. So in terms of the role of the office, we very much see this being around learning and development, about curated events, creative collaboration, things that are better done on walls rather than through screens, and a strong focus on socializing and mentoring. So for sure, we see that these shifts are looking at fundamental changes in how and where we work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That raises a lot of very interesting, fascinating questions. But we'll move on. Just to remind everyone again, do use the chat column. Nigel, your turn.
Okay, thank you, Derek. I'll just bring my slides up. So Derek asked me to speak about the impact of lessons learned from psychology, and it's quite a big subject area. And I thought today I'll just focus in on personality. Even that's big enough as a subject in itself. So I started thinking about personality and how it impacts on the working environment after reading a book, which you may have come across, by Susan Cain, called Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And what Susan Cain was saying is that the businesses want extroverts, and people they tend to have to perform like extroverts. But actually, there's as many introverts, for example, in the office as extroverts. And what she also said is that a lot of offices these days are being designed more with extroverts in mind. So, for example, more stimulating, brighter colors, noisier and buzzier. So she was saying it's time to readdress that. I have to say, when I've been around offices, I have seen the buzzy, stimulating spaces, but also you do see a lot of homogenous working environments. And I'm not sure that such environments like this are good for either introverts or extroverts. But we do see, when it comes to the workspaces themselves, that they're pretty homogenous, rows of desks and so on. And of course, in the workplace, what makes a company or a team more productive, more successful, is actually having a rich mixture of personality types. You need the people who are a bit more outspoken, speak off the cuff, and are willing to get up and do presentations. You need those people, but you also need the people behind the scenes who are into the detail and do the complex analysis and the research and analysis. So the team needs to be that mixture of personalities. And I actually use what's called the Big Five Personality Inventory, which was developed by Berkeley University, and it's got 5 personality scales, personality traits. But today I'm just going to focus on 2, and that's the extroversion-introversion scale and the neuroticism to emotional stability scale. The extroverts, as you know, tend to be outgoing. They like company, they like being with people, they're risk takers, they're thrill seekers, whereas the introverts tend to prefer their own company, think things through, they like a bit more detail and so on. Neurotic, which is a horrible term, but basically that relates to people who are a little bit more apprehensive, a little bit more nervous, versus emotionally stable people who are a little bit more go-lucky free type people and don't get et up and bogged down worrying about things so much. So I'm going to refer to those 2 scales of personality in my presentation. And I'm going to share with you very quickly, obviously in 15 minutes, I'm going to share with you 3 studies that I've been involved in where we've looked at the effect or the impact or the requirements for different personality types. And the first one I did was with a study with Herman Miller, and we were looking at how we can develop spaces that enhance collaboration and interaction in the workplace with different personality types. the first thing we noticed is that actually when it comes to why we meet for different reasons. It might be for sharing knowledge, or it might be for coming together to brainstorm and create ideas, or just socialize or whatever. So we were asking our people about their preferences for meeting spaces for these 5 different activities. And the analysis got quite complicated, and as I say, overlaid on top of where people wanted to meet, we also started to look at where different personality types preferred to meet, and so on. I'm not going to present all the statistics today. You can read that in the report. This is a very broad summary showing some of the more statistically significant effects. But just to summarize that table for you, well, as you can see, on the left side there, we've got the different types of meeting space, and across the top, we've got the different reasons for going to that meeting space. And you can see that sometimes extroverts prefer those different spaces to introverts, emotionally stable prefer different spaces to the more neurotic people. And basically what it came down to was that extroverts and emotionally stable people, they prefer informal meetings, they prefer to meet in smaller groups, they like to meet in informal settings like breakout spaces, cafes, even bars, even the pub. They like that kind of informality of meeting. Whereas our introverts and neurotics, they tend to prefer more formal meetings in a more formal setting, either a meeting room with closed doors, privacy, minutes taken, or maybe meeting in a private office if they have one, or their boss has one, or so on. Also, both of them prefer to use email over meetings face to face. And I always say you can tell whether you've got an introverted or an extroverted colleague, for example, because in a meeting, the extroverts are the ones who you can't shut up. They keep saying, oh, let me, tell me about it, I'm going to talk. Whereas the introverts are really quiet, and then at the end of the meeting, they send you an email, a 20-page email explaining all the things that you did wrong in your meeting. So just bear that in mind. So my second study, and I've been looking at acoustics now for about 5 years, and again, this journey is developed. We started with literature review, looking at what the literature said was required in terms of how we solve the noise issue, the noise distraction in particular in working environments, and looking at how that affects different personality types. Now, acousticians, and this is CIBSE, so maybe there'll be some acousticians in the audience, but acousticians tend to dwell on different ways of measuring sound. They've got all sorts of different measurement techniques. Some favor some techniques like speech intelligence over reverberation times, over just standard sound levels and so on. But they've got a whole different way of actually measuring sound. But the problem is, when you look at the research, is that sound level, the physical measurement, only accounts for about 25% of the variation in our response in terms of noise annoyance. And that other 75% that can't be measured is basically down to psychological and personal factors. So obviously, as a psychologist, that's a bit I'm interested in. If I can crack the 75%, I can help resolve that noise issue in offices. Now, this data, it may not like there's massive differences here, but they're all statistically significant, and there's small to medium effects. But basically, what our survey found, and it was a survey of about 700 people, what our survey found, just like the literature that's gone before, is that actually, yes, in the workplace, the more emotionally stable people can basically cope with noise better than those who have a more neurotic personality. And they can tolerate noise a bit better, and they're less distracted by it. And likewise, as you might expect as well, extroverts, they can also cope with noise a lot better than introverts. In fact, if you read some of the research, extroverts thrive on stimulation, so they like noisy, buzzy environments. It stimulates them, and they can actually perform better, whereas the introverts would find it distracting, and noise can actually obviously have a negative effect on their performance. And actually what you find is that certain roles are attracted by personality types. So, for example, we know, and Nicola mentioned it, that extroverts, they're more into sales and marketing and so on, whereas introverts might be more into research and analysis and things like that. So although I'm looking at personality, there is actually overlap with roles as well. When you look at it in a little bit more detail about noise distraction, you can see even larger differences between the emotionally stable and the neurotic, or between extroverts and introverts. So we have to account for our different personality types if we're trying to mitigate noise distraction in the office. And if you go into even more detail, we're starting to look at how the introverts and extroverts, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, sorry, how introverts and extroverts respond when they're in different types of spaces as well. So you can see here that introverts, they actually prefer private offices to extroverts, and they don't perform so well in hot desking environments as our extroverts do. So my third and final bit of research I wanted to share with you today is the last study I did, which is about office preferences. I was getting really upset about all the bad press about open plan environments, so I just wanted to unravel why open plan was being so negatively broadcast in the media. And what I did to start the research is I just asked people to rate their preferences, just on a 1 to 7 point scale, rate their preferences of these 6 different types of working environment, ranging from standard open plan through to private offices, and then something we described as this landscaped hybrid office, which is open plan but broken up with some semi-partitioning pods, meeting rooms, and so on. I also asked them if they had any preference for agile working or smart working or activity-based working. And also I separated out desk sharing, hot desking as well. And finally, if they had any preferences for home working. And so what I'm going to just plot here is the average scores for each of those 6 working environments. And I have to say, I was really surprised by the results, because private offices was the least preferred for our sample. And this was a sample of about 700 as well. So the offices were least preferred, which surprised me. We did have a lot of managers in the survey. And later when we talked to them, they were saying actually they prefer to be out in the open plan amongst their staff. Open plan was mid-range, as was hot desking, but we actually saw high preferences for landscaped offices, agile working, and even home working. This was done pre-COVID as well. So if I break that same 6 preferences, 6 working environments down by introverts and extroverts, you can see here that the extroverts, again, as you might expect, more preference for hot desking and agile working, whereas our introverts have a higher preference for private offices. And even though the numbers don't look big on the scales, we're talking about a 20% difference between introverts and extroverts. So for a survey of this nature, that's quite big. But what was interesting was we didn't get any differences for home working for introverts and extroverts. We expected introverts to be more comfortable at home and have a higher preference for home working. When I've talked to introverts after, and in other work we've been doing, whilst introverts do like the privacy of working from home, we've also found that they kind of like routine and they like regularity, and they like coming in the office where they know where things are, and they've got their equipment to hand, and they can separate out home from work and so on. Extroverts, of course, easily distracted in the home and like to speak to people, which they can do digitally, to be fair. We didn't get such big differences with the neurotics versus the emotionally stable. The main difference was between hot desking. Neurotics really do fear the idea of hot desking and not being able to find a desk when they get to work. So those are my 3 studies, all about personality and how we should be thinking about what different personality types need when we're designing offices. You may have large groups of particular personality types. You may have a mixture, and then you've got the challenge of how do you design for a mixture of personalities. That work has now led me into starting to look at neurodiversity and inclusivity and how we can design spaces to make people on the autistic spectrum a little bit more comfortable. We now, well, I'm working with one company, and I've visited other companies where they are employing people on the autistic spectrum because of their high cognitive functioning, and but obviously they also suffer from either hyper or hyposensitivity. So there is a challenge about how we design spaces for those people, and I think that again is something we're going to see through. So, in conclusion, people, we're all different. Respect that, embrace that. That's what makes us beautiful, is the fact that we are all different and we're not the same. So let's start in designing our environments for different people. And I say, in particular, I think we've got to start thinking about personality now in workplace design and how we design for the different personality types, especially if you've got open plan environments. And then finally, my final point is also now let's start looking at how we can design for those on the autistic spectrum as well. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. That's really interesting. That you may note, Nigel, that you've raised a lot of questions there from Peter Thomas, Jennifer Veitch, and Amy, which you may like to consider as we go along. So that was a very stimulating talk. Thank you, Nigel. Now we move to Piers McNaughton. So Piers, over to you.
Thanks, Derek. Hello, everyone. Let me get my slides up. There we go. As Derek mentioned, I'm a research associate at Harvard and also director of health strategy at VIEW. And I know Harvard has a long history, but for VIEW, it's a newer company. So what VIEW does is we make smart windows that dynamically tint to mitigate glare and optimize views. And I'll touch on that a bit later, but I thought I'd start by going back to some of my work previously at Harvard and just setting the stage around the exposures in the built environment. And we spent some time thinking through the totality of factors that matter for health and the environment. And we came up with these 9 foundations that we spent more time digging into to understand how are people's health in the workplace impacted by the environment. And I won't dive too much into this right now with only 15 minutes, but I would recommend that you check out forhealth.org. That's where the Healthy Buildings program lives. And we have a page on the 9 foundations, and we actually have a really nice guidance document that has 2 pages on each of these foundations, just outlining the literature behind it, how it impacts health, how it impacts productivity. So I'd recommend you start there, and you can dive into those into more detail. But I thought I'd kind of flip it around for these 15 minutes and focus more on the outcome side. And in the workplace, we kind of bin it into these 3 different factors. We have, of course, physical health. We have engagement, are people present and excited to be at work? And then lastly, are they productive? And these sort of build on top of each other. If you're physically healthy, it's easier to be engaged. If you're healthy and engaged, it's much better, much more easy for you to be productive in the environment. So I'll talk through these in a little bit, but the main underlying importance of why we care about people in the office environment is because we've really seen a shift in the past 30 years where it used to be in the 70s, where a lot of the assets of companies were tied up in their physical assets. Now, as we move more towards the technological age, we're really relying a lot more on our employees, and that's now where 90% of our salaries and benefits are really what's driving the economics for companies. So the shift in focus has really put more emphasis on the workplace as not just an asset, but as something to actually make people healthier and more productive in the workplace. But counterintuitively, over the same span of time, in the 70s, we had the oil crisis, and we sort of changed our design paradigm to make buildings that were very energy efficient because they were cheaper. And so we made them, we sealed them up. They were less ventilation. And we also kind of boxed them in. We took away a lot of the windows where the heat was coming in. And so you see over the course of the last 40 years, this trend where ventilation rates have gone down. And unsurprisingly, over the same span, the kind of occurrence of these new problem buildings, sick building syndrome that was starting to crop up in these areas or these new buildings that were designed with these kind of poor environmental conditions. And this is only a selection of the number of the different ways that the environment can impact people from a health standpoint and symptoms. But here are some of the cause and effect that's behind that, whether it's ventilation. Certainly, we've seen more emphasis in the last 6 months on the role of ventilation from a disease standpoint with COVID and certainly with other diseases. And then on the daylighting side and views, there's a whole number of different outcomes there around, eye strain, headaches, depression, stress. As having the view behind me as I do, I tend to have even more awareness of the impact of views. It just makes it that much easier to be able to focus and be creative. Switching over to employee engagement, there has been a lot of work that's kind of shown that if people are satisfied with the workplace, that drives their overall engagement, and that engagement impacts their productivity. From a workplace standpoint, obviously the workplace is used to attract talent as well as maintain it, and the workplace does that in both cases. It helps as a recruiting tool, certainly, but it also helps people feel like they're valued and feel like they want to be at work, and thus that makes them more productive. You have people that really value the work they're doing. So the workplace does play a significant role in that, in addition to their job position and other factors, but it isn't something that should be dismissed when you think about what makes people excited about their job and what makes them kind of eager to show up each day. And then lastly, thinking about the big picture of productivity, this is kind of the economic model behind real estate now. It kind of alludes to that earlier slide about the 90% of costs that are on the employees. Back in the 70s, there's maybe a bigger impact of energy. Nowadays, for every dollar you spend on energy, you're spending 10 times of that on the rest of your real estate, whether the mortgage, the lease, whatever it might be. And then you're spending 10 times of that on the employees for their salaries and benefits. So any small benefit you make to their bottom line performance is going to quickly, surpass any of the other economic drivers. And so that's been something that I've been focused on for a while, is trying to figure out what is the productivity impact on employees by making healthier environments, and then how can you justify that back to the real estate groups to then make those changes into the space. So I'll do a quick run through of a study we just completed, which I think helps drive this home. It's called the EVOLV study, and it just published a couple months ago, so it's relatively fresh off the presses. And for this work, I partnered with two professors, Dr. Mohammed Boubekri from University of Illinois and Dr. Usa Satish, who I've worked with for a long time, who's really a cognitive expert. And so she's been my main partner to look at how productivity can be impacted by the built environment. And she has developed a tool over many years, and actually in predating her, there's a team that helped develop this tool out of Yale and Princeton. And it's a bit unique in the sense that it's really looking at your typical knowledge worker. It's not a reaction time test or a memory test. It's about your ability to make decisions. You put in a simulation for an hour and a half, and over the course of that hour and a half simulation, you have to basically manage this town. And it's really putting you in a kind of managerial role and testing your ability to be effective at kind of managing that situation. So it's a bit unique in that sense, but I think it does a great job of capturing the type of work that most people do, and therefore a good indicator of overall productivity. And this study, it's somewhat of a similar to the CogEffect study that I'd done previously at Harvard, which focused on ventilation. In this case, we're looking more at daylight and views, and we really wanted to isolate that single factor and maintain everything else the same over the course of the exposure period for our participants. We had 30 people relocate from their regular offices into one of these two rooms, and they spent 1 week working in each. So after spending 1 week in one of the rooms, they then swap to the other rooms. So they get 1 week in each of the two conditions. And as I mentioned, we kind of measured everything else. So temperature, air quality, overhead lighting, all of that's consistent. We're really just looking at the impact of that difference in whether they have a blind installed, as you see on the left, or on the right, we have the view dynamic glass, which is tinting over the course of the day based on where the sun is to help mitigate the potential for glare, while at the same time bringing in more daylight when there isn't the sun that could cause glare. So it kind of optimizes that daylight and view condition. And what we found is, I'll just show you the raw data, which I think is pretty exciting. We were definitely blown away by this. Each of the gray boxes that's there is one of the participants in our study. And I'll start by showing you the 15 people that went from the blinds condition for the first week over to the view condition. And I'll show you the other 15 people after that. And the design was that they would take the cognitive test on the Monday and Friday of each week. So they'd have a total of 4 tests. So this shows you the initial score they had in the test. They stayed there for the rest of the week, and then on the afternoon of Friday, they took the test again. Every single participant had their cognitive scores decrease from Monday to Friday after being in there for a week. Then they came back the following Monday, they took the test again. Pretty much off the bat, they're already performing better than they had on the previous 2 tests the week before. And not only that, over the course of the week, every single participant had their cognitive scores increase with more time in the space. We looked at the sleep quality of the people that were in those 2 different rooms and saw that each night while they were in the space with view glass, because they're getting that better daylight exposure, it's helping entrain their circadian rhythm. That caused them to actually sleep 37 minutes more each night. So it makes sense that over the course of a week, if you keep getting more sleep in a better condition for daylighting and views, that you would end up having better performance accumulating over the course of that week. And then conversely, for the flip group, just to make sure there wasn't some temporal factor, we saw very much the same trend where over the course of the week in the view condition, their scores are improving. And then conversely, in the blinds condition, their scores are decreasing with more time in the space. So the last step that we worked closely with Usha on was translating those cognitive scores over to a economic output that we could then take back to the real estate groups and make the case that they should be investing in this increase in productivity. So we were able to take those raw test scores and benchmark them against a data set of 100,000 previous test takers. We found that in the blinds condition, our participants were right around the 52nd percentile, just about average, which was good to show that we had a good recruitment in terms of our workforce. And then they shifted to the 65th percentile when they moved to the view condition. So if you compare that against salary data, this is from the US, so you have to kind of update this based on the workforce you're looking at and the region, but it should be pretty consistent. We found that across the 4 different job categories we had, there's a 21% increase in cognitive function. And then that changed based on the job category, but that was the kind of consistent change we found, and it mapped out to about a $11,000 per employee per year benefit. So when you compare that back to the upfront cost of whatever enhancement you're going to put in, whether it's better ventilation, better facade solution, those benefits far outweigh the upfront capital cost that has to be done. So if you're a forward-thinking company, that's an investment that's worth going for. So I'll wrap up there and turn it back to Derek.
Right, thank you very much, Piers. All the work you mentioned there related to cognitive function are so important. And I think I'm right in some of your colleagues at Harvard, Professor Yin has been doing work about biophilia and found some similar effects with cognitive function in the way you were talking then. So
Absolutely.
Yes, and it really makes this impact of the environment on our minds are really so important, whether you're in a school learning or whether you're in the office taking decisions. Okay, that's terrific. And I see there's a nice chat going on with Nigel and several questions there on the chat column. And there'll be others, I'm sure, for you, Piers, in due course. Right, so now we come to our last speaker, which is Valerie Mace, who I'm glad to welcome from the University of Arts in London. And this is interesting because our speakers this afternoon all have slightly different disciplines. And the University of the Arts is a very, very creative, more unusual university in respect of its width in what the word creativity means. So I'm particularly interested to hear you, Valerie, and I'm sure everybody will. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So I will share my slides first. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for your fantastic talks. A little bit, because as Derek pointed out, I come from a slightly different perspective. So a little bit about my background. I come from an interior and spatial design background with kind of a strong interest in design-led research, so developing new knowledge for design. And I'm especially interested in the sensory emotional relation between people and environment. So here the topic is the workplace. And I'd like to stress that my work and my research do not necessarily focus on one typology of space. It applies to a range of spaces, but of course, including the workspace. My work is interdisciplinary, bringing together principles from sensory design in an architectural context, environmental psychology, phenomenology, and even anthropology at times. So this talk stems from the understanding that spaces where the sensing body becomes intimately connected to its environment can contribute to well-being. So I'm kind of exploring very briefly the research priorities for sensory design in the workplace. So it's about general concerns, and it's not specifically related to the current COVID situation. First, I'd like to draw on Derek's work on flourishing environments. Derek was chairing this talk because I draw from his work to define well-being as the way individuals can feel about themselves in relation to their environment. So if we go back, the first study of this kind was by, I believe, psychologists Maslow and Mintz in the 1950s. So I won't go into the details of the research, but suffice to say that they evidenced a correlation between the design of spaces and well-being, and more specifically, how this correlation was governed by sensory phenomena and stimuli, so by the design of the space. So from a human-centered perspective, beyond physical and functional needs in the workplace, I would suggest for research priorities to center on the more qualitative aspects of experience, the perceptual and the emotional governed by sensory design. And I'm not saying that this kind of research doesn't exist. I'm suggesting that there is scope for gathering qualitative data to enhance and promote its significance and importance. And in a way, this stems from kind of my motivation behind this is because I've come across many instances where the significance of sensory design was not always recognized or understood. And this is not new. And there is back in the 1960s, there's an architect called Sinclair Galdi, who's Scottish, made a comment which I think is quite striking, and I will quote from him. He said, "To live in an environment which has to be endured or ignored rather than enjoyed is to be diminished as a human being. The society which ignores this fact is at risk, for it is presuming too far upon human adaptability. Drabness, confusion, and mediocrity make an imponderable but real contribution to the frustration and depression which produce stultified, sick, or apathetic citizens." So that's quite a powerful comment. And sadly, in some instances, this can still be true today. So I believe that we need to explore how we can deliberately apply sensory design principles to enrich our experience of the workplace. So to do this, we need to understand what we mean by sensory design. So broadly speaking, I would define sensory design as the practice of designing for all the senses, never forgetting that the human body is the primary means of perception, which is the phenomenological underpinning of experience, and that feelings and emotions are part of the perceptual process and is obviously extremely complex. So sensory design also considers that our experience of the world is always multisensory, and also that the senses interact with each other. So the philosopher Gaston Bachelard poetically calls it the polyphony of the senses. One of the problems for sensory design that we have in Western culture is the dominance of the visual. So we exist in a kind of very much in an oculocentric paradigm. So to help me with my research, I designed a tool I call the sensory flow diagram, and I use the word flow because I consider experience as a flow and not made of distinct individual fragments. So the diagram, which you can see here on your screen, it can be used as a documentation tool or as a predictive tool for design. It's adaptable to different contexts. So the kind of terminology that is used in the example here is not always the same terminology that I use. I adapt it to the context of the studies. It's simple and legible and can also be used for comparative studies. So this is the example shown here is one of the first iteration that I used to illustrate a comparative study of 5 different areas within a location. So you can see at the top is kind of an isometric floor plan and showing each of the areas. And in fact, while I was doing this project, it was by using this tool that I was able to understand the differences in sensory phenomena across the site and divided it to 5 areas. So this tool is multisensory, and the characteristics do not represent a dualist positive-negative perspective, but a scale from low levels of stimuli to high level of stimuli. So at the moment, I'm also working on a PhD, and I'm using it again in my PhD to document the impact of porosity in an interior. So I'm exploring the impact of porous and liminal edges and open flows on people. And the sensory model I currently use includes sight, haptic sight, which is the ability to perceive tactile qualities through sight, skin and body contact, and I could have used touch, but I wanted to emphasize that the entire body is in direct contact with the environment, not just the hands, and sound, smell, and kinesthesia, the movement and position of the body. So this said, sensory design is not just a matter of applying multisensory principles to the design of a space. And this is not to undermine this process. It's not actually easy to do it well, but I'm saying that it's not just about sensations. Sensory design can enrich experience when you take a more interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary approach. And I believe this idea is taking momentum. In January 2020, I took part in a conference in Florida called Experiential Design, Rethinking Relations Between People, Objects, and Environments. And it was an interdisciplinary conference bringing together designers and artists of all kinds to celebrate and share strategies, compare practices, and advance dialogue about art, design objects, interiors, environments, and their relationships with people. And one of the contexts explored, which was pertinent to my research, was how interiors and buildings impact on mood and well-being. So I've talked about interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, so I'd like to kind of touch on what I mean by taking a more interdisciplinary approach. And effectively, what I mean is framing sensory design research and practice within a contextual framework that draws on different disciplines. There are a number of ways to approach this, and I'd just like to mention a couple here that come to mind. For instance, one of the approaches I've been looking at is a more ecological approach. After all, ecology is concerned with the relationship between organisms and environments. And the ecological approach can consider the environment of the workplace as an ecosystem constitutive of physical space, behavioral space, and emotional space brought together into one concern. Within the ecological approach, there's also scope for narrowing down the research priority. I think it's possible to, for instance, to link sensory design research to biophilia, which was mentioned earlier. And so use natural elements, real or figurative, in the design of spaces. There's also academic David Simon who writes about phenomenological ecology, which is a very interesting concept. And it's a terminology that he himself borrowed from another academic, Mark Wegner. So Simon defines phenomenological ecology as, I quote, an interdisciplinary field that explores and describes the way that things, living forms, people, events, situations, and worlds come together environmentally. Another approach that I've been considering is more anthropological, taking a cultural perspective and, for example, exploring the context that govern cultural conditioning or enculturation. So when a culture defines an event, even potentially constrains the way you think and what you do. And so one of the examples I'm looking at is how the words that we use can impact on the way we think and we design. Very simply, put in a very kind of basic way, calling an office or a desk automatically conditions and constrains the design of the workplace to a certain cultural context, to certain habits. And the question I'm asking, which I haven't answered yet, I'm working kind of around these topics, is should we question and rethink this position? There's an architect called Harry Francis Mulgrave who recently wrote about architecture being the practice, even the making of culture. And interestingly, drawing on the meaning of the Latin etymology of the word culture, the growing, tending, and cultivation of the land, Mulgrave defines culture in biological terms as, quote, the built and social environments in which the human organism either flourishes or withers, which kind of meets what I was talking about in terms of the ecology. So kind of the cultural element meeting the ecological context. So it follows that a research priority for sensory design in the workplace is to define how organizations, architects, designers, and stakeholders can work together to create cultures for the human organism to flourish. So to broadly summarize the priorities that kind of I've discussed in sensory design research for the workplace, and to conclude, I would bring forward the idea of documenting and analyzing existing spaces to enhance our qualitative awareness of environmental experience, which I think there's kind of a lot being done about this, and I think there's scope for more work, additional work to be done on this. Bringing the design of the workplace and people together into one sensory emotional model, moving away from an oculocentric paradigm to integrate multisensory perspectives. Of course, we can't do everything all at once, so we can define contextual frameworks for the research, exploring opportunities beyond what we know and how we think about existing workplace design. And with this in mind, the notion of transdisciplinarity, which underpins this webinar, is incredibly important. And this, however, could not be achieved by one individual, but only through deliberate and active collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. You've introduced, for some of us, I think, probably some new reference material there. And your 5 items you listed at the end in collaboration, transdisciplinarity, we should pay more attention to qualitative work and not be afraid to tackle the emotional impacts of the environment on us, and the framework context are all, seems to me, most important. And of course, TWR, the first word is transdisciplinary. So Rian may want to come back from the audience and talk a little bit more about that. In terms of collaboration, some of you may have seen E.O. Wilson's book, The Origins of Creativity. In 2017, he brought that. And the basis of his book was that we should not divide natural science, social sciences, and art. We should actually look at bringing those together. That's where you get sparks of creativity, new ideas, fresh ways of looking at things. And I'm sure that is something that's very much in our mind. And if there is any good thing about COVID, it's making us probably rethink a little bit about some of these matters. When I started in the industry of my career, it's about 50 years ago now, a long time ago, I worked in a company and we hardly did any measurement at all. But if we did any measurement, it was simply a thermometer, a little bit of vein anemometry, and that was about it. And the idea at those times of assessing people's mood and the impact of the environment that would be absolutely, people would look at you with a blank stare, I think. So things have changed a lot over my career, at least, in the workplace, and this is very good to see. So now I see there's a lot of discussion going on the text, and I think most of the questions were a lot to Nigel and some to Piers, but most of them seem to have been answered by Nigel. Has been very busy. Nigel, do you want to add anything to that experience you've had with all those questions?
No, I mean, well, first of all, thank you for the questions. It's good to hear from Jennifer as well. I've not met her for a long time now, and also Brian, of course, who I know. But yeah, I think the thrust of my presentation was that we need to acknowledge the different personality types, the different varieties of people, rather than assume that we know who the occupants are. And because if we don't understand the different personality types and the other personal factors, and we've already talked about age and other factors from the other presenters, we tend to design for ourselves. And I've come across that with architects in the past, where if you don't give them a good brief and you don't explain to them who the occupants are, what roles they do, what their personality types are, how they work, their fears, their concerns, they can end up designing a space which suits them and doesn't suit the people who are going to be there. So that was the thrust of my presentation. I think we've just got to be more cognizant of the range of people now in the workplace, whether that's personality, age, neurodiversity, whatever. It's getting more and more complicated, and as the discipline becomes more established, I think now's the time to start thinking just beyond the thermometer measurements, Jarek, and the basic physical measurements, and start looking at the emotional elements and the personal factors as well.
Right. Thank you, Nigel. That's interesting. And I see I would like to invite Rhian Apple-Mullenbrook to talk to us if she's...
Yes, I'm here.
Would you make some comments on what you've heard and in general?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I really like the presentation, and it's nice to have this combined webinar, because we have, I can see a lot of people in the chat from the TWR network, but also a lot that I don't know yet. So it's nice to get to know these people a bit as well. Yeah, as you said, Derek, this transdisciplinary approach gives a lot of opportunities to attack problems that so far we haven't really been able to solve, by also looking at sociology and looking at psychology and combining this with all kind of design approaches and other real estate and types of theories. And as you know, we are also working on a book series to get this connection of different types of theories that could relate to workplace design, and also how they fit with people. So yeah, we are doing our best to get more knowledge across disciplines. Being a scientist myself, I still notice that I find new theories and information every week, and then I'm surprised, why didn't I ever see that before? This theory works, so it explains a lot of what I do, and I didn't know it existed. So yeah, I'm still very committed to crossing borders of the disciplines and making sure that we get to know what we are all doing. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ray. Any questions now? Wide open to all of you to ask any questions. No, not at the moment.
I've got one, Derek.
Nigel.
Because I'm quite interested in Valerie's area of research. The sensory design is something that fascinates me as well. And I mentioned at the end about neurodiversity, so I wondered if Valerie had done any work looking at the different requirements from the multisensory perspective for people on the various spectrums.
Hi, Nigel. Hang on, let me put the camera. my work hasn't been right now. I haven't been looking at people of a different spectrum. I know there is a lot of work in that area, but it's quite a very the human, as you know, the people are very complex, and even looking at a kind of a broad range of neurodiversity requires to some degree, in some instances, it requires a degree of specialization and knowledge, which I haven't gone into yet. That doesn't mean that there is no scope for that in the future, but that's not the focus of what I'm doing at the moment. I've been looking at kind of more, what I've been focusing on is the relationship between the individual and the collective environment at this stage.
All right, thank you very much, Valerie.
I thought Nigel's comment about architecture and their preferences versus others was really interesting, because there definitely are often discrepancies, and I know I've always had a personal issue with the aesthetics versus the functionality of a space. We actually did a quick little thought experiment where we sent just office images out to a bunch of respondents and asked them to give their preference, which one they preferred side by side. And we then went back to architects and asked them their preferences, and they often sided with the marginal groups, the ones that were less preferred by the just general respondents who were working in offices. So I think it is something to be mindful of in the architecture community, to think about getting more feedback from maybe the customer, more focus groups, just to make sure that your own preferences aren't biased, because you have so much ingrained knowledge around design, which is something that most people don't have backgrounds in.
Can I comment on that, actually? This is something that, yes, I would very much agree. This is something I'm quite familiar with. My training, I'm very conscious my training as a designer has a massive impact on the way I perceive spaces. And so I'm conscious that the kind of prior experiences of people, their professional background, their kind of all these different things comes into it. And so that's something that comes into my research very much, and people are very much involved. So when I'm working on a certain type of space, I am always I approach it from different perspectives. One is the perspective of someone like myself who has the training and can understand certain things that perhaps the people who are using that space on a daily basis may not understand and experience. But their experience as well is very important, and the way where the two meets, or the kind of a comparative studies between them, is very much part of my work, because it's just something I've noticed very often as a designer. The kind of the people respond very differently to spaces than I would do, and it's quite challenging. I think it's fascinating but very challenging at the same time. It's a very great comment.
Yes.
Yeah, just have being cognizant.
Could I come back? One, and anyone really, but Valerie perhaps in particular. I saw years ago some papers talking about how we need to have sensory diversity in the field. In practice, earlier years, a long time ago, one used to aim for sort of uniform environments. But in fact, more recent work is suggesting that we need to have much more variations in the environment to stimulate our minds throughout the day, so we say the working day. Any comments on that, Valerie, or anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, if it's there is such thing as too much stimuli as well. So we need a certain level of variations, and we need some kind of sensory variations, because, as I said, it's to do with the human body is designed for that.
Yes,
we are designed for a kind of sense. We are kind of multisensory beings. So, in a way, it goes against our kind of physiology and who we are to kind of not provide this.
Absolutely, yes. And of course, we're seeing a very interesting debate at the moment on touch. And you mentioned the skin, and skin is the biggest organ of the body. And even today on Radio 4, there was a discussion about people are missing touch at all sorts of levels because of the COVID situation. And and of course, it's having an impact socially as well. And, what is okay and what's not okay. But we do need some touch somewhere. Where how do we fit it into our lives? Very, very century. I'd like to just switch back to Nicola, because Nicola is the person here in practice doing the work all day on different projects. And Nicola, what do you feel, having heard the other three presentations, what strikes you from your point of view?
I think in the world of workplace particularly, and I think we see the same in healthcare, we have increasingly expert clients and occupiers. So I think that is putting, rightly, more pressure on the professionals to come up with more rigor and a more research-based approach, which is only right. I think we have a very long way to go. And I think an observation would be, I think there is quite a gap actually between what occupiers and client organizations are asking for and demanding in order to be able to sell these ideas to their CFOs and boards, and how that's getting filtered back into university education. I think that loop is broken. I don't see a really strong link there. And so we often get, there are very few courses out there where we get graduates coming out that are thinking in terms of, you know, a data-led approach. So I think that's a bit of a challenge for us. But I think increasingly we have a very interested audience in terms of occupiers in this. The challenge is always, you know, creating succinct, to the point, so what outputs. Whereas obviously our inclination as researchers and writers is to go deeper and explore and keep exploring and keep going. But the time scale of the occupier and client world is short, and the attention span is short. So the challenge to get to, so what does this mean, is a challenge for us.
Yes. I mean, in the university world, we recognize that in the world of transdisciplinarity, it's not really effective to have all separate faculties. But we're stopped by mixing these up as we might like to, because of the logistics of accounting and money problems and so on. But there are more now links between psychology, for example, and engineering and architecture. So you can feel the ground is moving, it's shifting. And the balance between reductionist thinking and between thinking in a qualitative way is now accepted as a good way forward in our methodologies for dealing with the built environment. And I see that in all your papers, Piers, a lot of measurements of numerical quantities, but also a lot of survey of how people feel and so on. There is a question for you, Nicola, if I can find it again, just a moment. Nicola, what is your best guess why EMEA responses were more negative than the rest?
Yes, thank you. That saves me. It's my partly sent a response there. I think talking to HR professionals about this, they would accept that there are cultural biases across countries, which is a very interesting perspective. They would see that the UK can be more, and again, it depends on your personality, the words you're going to use, you know, pessimistic, realistic. The US, for example, is in general, horrible to generalize here, a very extroverted culture. So there's a tendency towards positivity, and across Asia, this varies enormously. You know, certain countries, again, depending on government circumstances, etc., you know, people feel more or less freedom to speak. And this impacts the way that people respond to surveys. But it has been very revealing talking to HR across large corporates and their expectations that the answers in country X are likely to be lower than the answers in country Y, regardless of the question we ask. Yes. Which is fascinating. I mean, I have also heard, you know, and I won't go into the individual countries, but in one particular country, I remember a head of HR saying, every engagement survey we get back, the responses are fantastic. They are so pumped, they're so engaged, they're so with the program, and then they stand up and resign the next day, and we've no idea why.
Mm.
So I think there's a strong, that whole, yes doesn't mean yes thing that we've all experienced in terms of implementing workplace projects.
I wonder, Nigel, I have also read about our susceptibility to the environment. I wondered if you could perhaps comment on, it was suggesting that in a very general sense, without any great position, that there are about 10 or 15% of people very susceptible to environments, and there's at the other end of the scale a few that are fairly insensitive to the environment. In between, there's a mixed response. Is that got any truth in it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, that's partly why I got interested in the personality work, because we tend to, like, everything's a normal distribution, isn't it? Whether you look at personality, autism, whatever, and we designed for the middle bit of the normal distribution, and as I was saying, I think we can learn from looking at the extremes, the canaries, if you like, the hypersensitive and the hyposensitive people. We can learn from them and understand what makes what are their preferences and what are their requirements for the space. And as I said, particularly because we're now inviting, we're now using wanting those people in the work environment more so than ever. So I think you will see that differences, and I think, again, it's come up in the chat and everywhere, that don't just design for the masses or the norm. You need to design for variation and individuality. The only way you can do that is through flexibility, choice, empowerment. You touched on it, Derek, about designing work settings, different activity-based settings, different variation. I'd love to see working environments where you've got different light levels, different temperature levels, so people go and choose where they want to sit based on their personal preferences, rather than all being forced to be sat at the same light level and temperature level. Now, obviously, in an open plan environment, which most of us now have to work in, it's a little bit more difficult. But I think you can provide zones, and different zones with different settings. There's other work that's shown that if you give people the choice, they migrate to the space where they feel comfortable, rather than migrate to the space next to their boss or in a team zone.
I think our methodologies, which we've been using for quite a long time, where we looked at averages, was a bit misleading, because I wonder, I don't know your view, and Piers may have some comment on this, that if we look at the hypersensitive group, that could be very interesting, because when you mix it up, when you mix them all up, you land up with a sort of bland result in a way. And if we tested the hypersensitive, probably the other people would be quite happy probably with quite a lot of that, because it's going into things which maybe they're not bothered about all that much, and they've got a wider or a lower expectancy maybe of the environment, and they would be very happy with that. I don't know if you think that would be a good idea in our methodologies. We should perhaps separate out the subjects more than we do, rather than mix them all up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest mistake a lot of researchers make is that we rely too much on means and medians, and we should be looking at ranges and standard deviations. Yes. That's the first point. But Valerie's already made the point that you have to, for introverts, for example, they seek calming, subdued environments. They don't want stimulating, buzzy environments. So you have to look at both ends of the spectrum.
Yes. I mean, I think the old arousal theory showed you that, didn't it?
Yeah, arousal theory.
You don't want to be in a bland, dull environment. On the other hand, you don't want to be in a nervous, frenetic environment. And it's a kind of optimum range. I think the thing in practice that has been slower to be appreciated is the impact of the environment on the mind. And Piers, you referred to quite a few graphs there with cognitive functioning and so on. And I'm aware of Udaya Sati's work, which you referred to, the effect of CO2, for example, and others. People around the world have done kind of similar studies. Her methodology is rather different, but it's all going in the same direction. And in practice, it's been always hard to appreciate that these very practical matters of air flowing around the place and light has an effect on the mind. Would you like to extend that sort of argument, Piers?
Yeah, definitely. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I think it's important, to Nigel's point, not to be gravitating towards the mean, and not just from research, but also the standards. Like take thermal comfort, where we're designing, these ASHRAE standard to have at least 20% of people be uncomfortable. That's the design standard. And same with ventilation, it's a minimally acceptable standard. So there's definitely a need to be a little more nuanced in the way that we create spaces to have variability. I think the missing gap there, though, is that you can even introduce that variability and people might not know. If someone comes into a new building, they don't know where the warm spot is, the cold spot, the quiet spot, the loud spot. So that's something that we've been trying to overcome at VUE over the last 6 months, is providing, through environmental sensing, a kind of spatial mapping of each of those 4 factors: noise, thermal comfort, air quality, and lighting, so that people can then gravitate through an occupant app to the spaces that are best for their preferences, because everyone is different. It is really personal, and it's important to have the ability to go in and customize those experiences.
Yes, indeed. I see in the audience Madalena Hank. Hello, can you hear me? Madalena? No, she can't hear me. I noticed she was there because she did a PhD on health and well-being at UCL about 2 years ago, and it was a very nice piece of work. Well, can I throw the questions open to everyone? Any other people would like to come forward with any more questions? Well, we're coming to the last few moments, so I will go back to the presenters. Is there anything any of you would like to add as a closing remark? Because these are going to be recorded and put onto the website for CIBSE and TWR. So any lasting comment you would like to leave with? Valerie?
Yeah, I mean, I would, one of the things that came to mind while people were talking recently, and Piers, for example, something you said, I was wondering, and I know we're close to the end, but I was wondering if anybody is looking at the notion of territoriality in research, because we are looking at having moving away from one size fits all. But I find I've done some kind of ethnographic style research of an office, and I found that people tend to gravitate towards one spot and then keep coming back and take ownership of it, which is was a very interesting findings. And in terms of closing remarks, I just would like, I think it's a very complex and fascinating topic, and I think we still got quite a lot of work to do, but there's a huge amount of work being done at the same time. So I think we just kind of keep having these kind of discussions will be very interesting.
And I've just noticed on the chat column here, Guy Newsham has brought up an interesting point about the interaction between the workplace and home working and the office. And I think he's saying, if I read the question, some of us have fully private office, others have other kinds of, how could measurements in home offices contribute in the design of the company office? Is there some interplay there? I mean, certainly we must carry forward images in our mind of places. It's definitely true, I think, in interior design. We go somewhere, or maybe you see it on television, you see certain environments and they go into your head, and then you carry over when you're perhaps arranging your home in some way or whatever. Any comments? Anybody like to come back on that?
I think it's a very interesting point, and I think this whole period is going to substantially change how people shop for homes and how we design homes. Especially in this part of the world, and again, there's a huge cultural difference. Typically in Europe, we don't have homes with spare rooms where there is only, you know, work is the only thing that happens there. But I think much as there is to be learned from the home environment, I think this period has also been difficult. You know, to quote a client, she said, "I don't feel like I'm working from home anymore. I feel like I'm living at work." So I think there is a real challenge there in terms of the divide, you know, in terms of us managing our time.
Right. Well, we are now drawing to the final 2 minutes, so I will just briefly conclude from all what you've said, and there's 4 great presentations, I think, all immensely interesting and very relevant to today's work on office design. But we are in a transition. This COVID has thrown us, and somehow the magic is, how do we deal with change? Because we can have something today which may not be suitable tomorrow. And those speeds of change which are happening within one generation, never mind across generations, are very important to deal with. And several of you have brought up this question of creativity. And as artificial intelligence becomes more prominent in our lives, so some jobs more utilitarian jobs may disappear. There's opportunities for more creativity. And so it's important to understand how environments around us affect creativity. I mean, you might argue that you can be creative anywhere, you know, but nevertheless, that's worth thinking about. And I think the other thing is that it's very important to take this word transdisciplinarity very seriously. We can learn so much from other sectors which may not be directly seem to be relevant to what we do, but actually there's some snippets of ideas there that work very well. And of course, all our industries are working at different pace. So I'm working on wearables at the moment, and if I want almost the latest information on wearables, I go to the medics because they're given a high priority in health, digital health. And I learn so much more than if I remain just in the construction industry and architecture, where there's a more limited use. They're not fully aware yet of all the possibilities of using those things. So I think by crossing the sectors, the disciplines, that's going to be important. That's important in our education as well as in practice. So on that note, I would like to thank you all, Valerie, Piers, Nicola, Nigel, for a fantastic trains of thought that we will go away in our evening, I'm sure, and ponder about. And thank you, the audience. We had just about 100 people attend. The sessions will be put on the website, and keep in touch. And I look forward to seeing you. Our next webinar is on November the 4th. I look forward to seeing you all again. And in between time, keeping in touch with each other. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.